I think negotiation is complex, even if it's a single issue and a one-time negotiation. It's complex because it involves perceptions, it involves behavior. And I love this quotation by Mencken, right? I mean, lots of people have easy answers to complex problems. I want to see if we can get a complicated answer to what I think is a complicated process. So here's the story. I've changed the names. Jay was a colleague of mine years ago when I taught at MIT, and he took a year off, kind of a practice sabbatical, and was advising an investment fund where the money had come from development on Route 128 around Boston. The person who had led the real estate firm had been smart enough to make the money in the first place and even smarter to get out while the getting was good. They were diversifying. And so my friend Jay and their team bought a cable television system in the Midwest. This was years ago. And they had paid $8 million for it. Some of that was their money, some was leveraged. Now, there are metrics for buying those kinds of things. How many subscribers do you have now? What are the demographics? How much could you expand the market? What kind of efficiencies and operations might you be able to institute? All of those things. They paid $8 million. And the notion was, we want to put a toe in the water. Maybe they were smart, maybe they were lucky. It turned out to be a very good investment, and the next thing to do, a year later, seemed to be let's scale up. And they approached Max, who owned the system in an adjoining community, and made a pitch to buy his system. And they were far apart on price. They figured they could pay 11 and a half, maybe have pushed $12 million. And Max, after a lot of back and forth, said, listen, we're not even close. I know you like what I've got here. I love what I've got. If you brought in non-sequential small bills, $15 million, and dropped it on the table, unmarked bills, you'd present me with a problem. I would think about taking it, but if I did, I'd probably kick myself. You don't give me anything to think about if we're not in that neighborhood or north. Now, one of you submitted a case where you'd worked long and hard to reach an agreement, and it turned out the deal just wasn't there. And there were some bad feelings in the end when you decided that you had to walk because you couldn't meet the other company's needs. So they're at 12. Max, the seller, is at 15. Jay got up to leave and said, I just have one question for you. He posed the question, and 10 minutes later, they were shaking hands on a deal. Now, obviously, they didn't read the Start With No book, but it wasn't getting to yes either, because there was no amount of smoke and mirrors that could obscure the fact that the seller valued the asset more than the buyer did, and yet they made a deal. They made a deal, I don't know if you remember, but Heinz used to come in bottles like that, and who was it? Carly Simon had the song Anticipation, or is it, they've got the right person? I always get her mixed up with Carole King. Is that? Carly Simon. Good, thank you. Okay, can I go on to the next round of pop music? So they were actually selling a defect as a virtue. You know, this is so good it's worth waiting for. And then somebody, probably got the Nobel Prize for condiments, said, what if we turned the bottle upside down? And in hindsight, that seems so obvious, and that's exactly what Jay and Max did. Jay wanted to buy the system, but Max was even more bullish on cable than he was. They flipped the deal. So what I find interesting about that story, Jay's a bright guy, very bright guy and accomplished. His counterpart, sitting at the same table, didn't see the opportunity because he was fixated on, I'm not going to sell, I'm not going to sell, I'm not going to sell, where the question might be, maybe I should buy, right? So when I talk about strategic agility, this is what I'm talking about, having that ability to look at a situation where it isn't what you expect it to be, but you can make some proverbial lemonade. So the premise here, an end of mini lecture coming up very shortly, is you can't script negotiation. I doubt that anybody would dispute that proposition. Of course you can't, right? I mean, if you have a negotiation coming up next week and I ask you, what's the fifth thing you're going to say? You don't know until you know what the fourth thing the other party said, right? But, and I want to make it clear, just because you can't script it doesn't mean you make it up as you go along. You wing it. For all these things, we have to acknowledge we're working in a changing environment. And what's interesting about it is the things that we do in the course of negotiation, asking a question, making an offer, drawing a line someplace, all those things that we do to try to determine, is there room for a deal, how much room, what are its contours, what are its parameters, all those things we do have an effect on the person or parties that we're dealing with. So in reading the situation and trying to read the other person, we're changing it in small or sometimes large ways. You read a book, it still has the same number of words, the same number of pages, whether you skim it or you read it very deliberately. When you're trying to engage a person, when you're trying to get some sense of what they can do and what they can't do, or whether you've stepped inadvertently on their toes, you're changing the environment. I like this phrase: don't ask reality to conform to your blueprint, adapt your blueprint to fit reality. And as we're negotiating, our preparation continues all the time. So we constantly have to be comparing the plan with the reality and adapting in the way that musicians do, doctors do, diplomats as well, and military.